for young and old as the government acts on unemployment. £15 a week towards the pay of youngsters getting a job. For the old, the option to retire at 62. Hand in hand, the royal couple leave St Paul's after a final rehearsal. And the Springboks tour of New Zealand, it will continue. The Prime Minister took the opportunity of today's censure debate against the government to announce a new package of measures to reduce unemployment, especially among school leavers and the young. The measures will cost about £400 million in a full year, on top of the £1,000 million the government's already spending to help those without a job. Mrs Thatcher's package includes an extra 110,000 places this year in the Youth Opportunities Programme, a £15 a week subsidy to firms for each young person under 18 taken on at a low wage, and an extra £60 million to be spent on encouraging youngsters to stay at school. 20 centres will be started in inner cities to train young unemployed in computer skills, while for the old, the age limit for the job release scheme will be cut from 64 to 62 by next spring to encourage early retirement. The opposition leader, Mr Foot, who'd opened the censure debate, immediately described the measures as derisory. Here's our political editor, John Simpson.
Mrs Thatcher's programme comes at a pretty crucial time in the government's fortunes. The current state of the economy is causing a great deal of misgiving, not just on the Conservative backbenches, but in the Cabinet and perhaps in the party hierarchy as well. Mrs Thatcher was clearly conscious of the need to be seen to do something. She was fulfilling an earlier promise today in taking action on youth unemployment, but following the outburst of rioting, there's been intense activity in Whitehall to get the package together. The Secretary of State for Employment, Mr Pryor, had previously put in a programme of his own for dealing with youth unemployment, costing £1,000 million. After an intense round of negotiations within the Cabinet, that was whittled down to today's announced figure, £700 million, though after the savings in supplementary benefits and unemployment money, the cost will be down to £400 million. The youth opportunity schemes that are already in existence would have taken 250,000 young people off the unemployment register by March 1983. The new schemes will double that to almost 500,000. Whether or not this will prevent the politically damaging figure of 3 million unemployed from being reached, ministers wouldn't hazard a guess today. One important element in today's package, the £15 incentive to employers to take on school leavers, was put forward by Downing Street rather than by Mr Pryor, though he explained the idea.
I don't think so. I think what it means is that there is an encouragement for employers to take on more young people, and those will be, as it were, permanent jobs in whatever society or whatever occupation they happen to be. And it will also, I think, have the effect of making young people perhaps more aware of the fact that they can price themselves into jobs, as well as, I think, has been happening in recent years, of young people tending to price themselves out of jobs.
Your package of measures is already being called a U-turn by the government. Is that a fair description of it?
Well, this is, I think, so silly. It's not a U-turn. On the other hand, it's a recognition of a very serious problem. Governments have to deal with problems as they come along. And if every time that you deal with a problem it's called a U-turn, then I think you get into a sort of political vocabulary which is really rather insulting to young people and to anyone you're trying to help.
When Mrs Thatcher announced the package in the Commons, Conservative MPs greeted it with enthusiasm and perhaps a certain amount of relief. It helped Mrs Thatcher to turn the edge of an opposition censure debate on her handling of the economy. But for his part, the Labour leader, Mr Foot, condemned the proposals as derisory, and he accused Mrs Thatcher of a total lack of imagination in dealing with the immense problem of unemployment. And although he, like other Labour MPs, seemed to see something of a change in government policy, it wasn't anything like enough for him.
There will be no upturn without a U-turn, and a U-turn of gigantic proportions. Unless such a change of direction occurs, we shall have the prospect of the 1980s differing from the 1930s in that there will be even larger numbers of people out of work, greater potential dangers of a resort to violence, and a rate of inflation infinitely higher.
The TUC wasn't impressed by the government's measures either. A spokesman said tonight that Mrs Thatcher was trying to stem a flood tide with a sandbag. But the CBI, for its part, felt that the package would greatly help Britain's young unemployed.
Although unemployment has been blamed as one of the underlying causes of the recent violence in Toxteth, Liverpool, black community leaders say last night's trouble was the direct result of continual police harassment. A taxi driver hurt in the rioting is still in a critical condition. David Davis reports.
The latest outbreak of violence was on the streets where the riots began 3 weeks ago. Police were stoned by gangs of up to 60 youngsters. 2 policemen were hurt. One had his arm broken by a heavy stone picked up from a nearby building site. But the taxi driver, a man of 52, was so badly injured that he's in a critical condition in hospital. His taxi hit a tree after the cab had been stoned by the mob. A group of community workers started to pull him out of the wreckage, but they saw he was so badly hurt that they had to stop until ambulance men arrived. And tonight, taxi drivers are being advised by their union not to go into the Toxteth area. The Environment Secretary, Mr. Heseltine, who's at present leading an inquiry into Liverpool's problems, was asked for his views on last night's violence.
Well, this is a matter for the police, and I'm not here to involve myself in trying to in any way undermine their position.
Are you disheartened at all that it happened again, although albeit on a much smaller scale?
Well, everybody must be disheartened at that sort of breakdown of law and order. It is obviously a very disturbing feature, which is of great concern to us all.
On the streets today, there were few reminders of the violence of last night in Toxteth, and the police say they have no evidence to indicate how or why it began.
7 scooter riders involved in the weekend trouble at Keswick in the Lake District have been fined £1,000 each and bound over for 2 years. 3 others were given suspended prison sentences of 6 months. They were said to come from the northeast, from Yorkshire and East Anglia. Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer this evening were at St Paul's for a final rehearsal as preparations elsewhere for the wedding gathered momentum. Guests continue to arrive in London. The Queen and Duke of Edinburgh are entertaining some to dinner tonight, and the royal yacht has left Britain ready for the honeymoon. Clive Ferguson reports on the day.
There had been large crowds along the route of the wedding procession throughout today, all hoping to get a glimpse of someone, preferably Prince Charles or Lady Diana. When they saw Prince Charles at St Paul's, they were to be disappointed if they wanted to see Lady Diana enter the cathedral for the unannounced wedding rehearsal. She went in through the cathedral basement. But their patience was rewarded an hour later when the couple emerged, hand in hand, having rehearsed, like every other couple about to be married, the lines they'll be saying to each other for real on Wednesday morning, shortly after 11 o'clock. And if the crowd had been disappointed by Lady Diana's avoiding them earlier, that didn't lessen the cheers as the future Princess of Wales and her prince were given some sort of idea of the reception they can expect in a couple of days' time before they drove off, giving the crowds their last glimpse of the royal couple together until they next emerged from St Paul's at about 12:20 on Wednesday. Hours earlier, the royal yacht Britannia left Portsmouth en route for Gibraltar, where the royal couple will join her on Saturday. And the controversy over that part of the honeymoon itinerary hasn't yet died. There's talk of a Spanish protest rally being held just across the border from the Rock of Gibraltar on Saturday. But before that somewhat sour note at the weekend, the Prince and Lady Diana will have had more than enough cheers along their wedding route. People have already arrived to camp out along the route to make sure they get a good view of proceedings. Mrs. Avril Harrison arrived yesterday afternoon from Somerset, complete with flask, deck chair and sleeping bag.
Well, we had rather a hectic night because we were being interviewed by various newspapers, and BBC London came along, and every time we dozed off they woke us up. Not nastily, they were very nice, nothing bad, but you know, we were feeling sort of like that. It should be all right on the day, don't worry.
The other people in London in force are journalists, and today they were anxiously quizzing the Buckingham Palace press secretary as to the whereabouts of the bride's wedding dress.
I don't believe the dress has been delivered anywhere yet.
But will it be delivered by America?
I would be most surprised if that was the case.
Some distance away from the wedding route, the finishing touches were being put to the other big pre-wedding event, tomorrow night's massive fireworks display in Hyde Park. As well as the fireworks, the crowd, some estimates say there'll be 750,000 people there, will get a last chance, almost, to see the Prince as a bachelor. He'll be there without Lady Diana to light the first in a chain of beacons up and down the country. Tonight, though, both Prince Charles and Lady Diana were at a dinner dance in Buckingham Palace. Most of the hundreds of guests were members of the royal family from all over Europe. But also there were some of the Prince's favourite pop group, the American girls singing group, the 3 Degrees. But for the crowd outside the palace, the most welcome sight was that of the Queen Mother, arriving for the dinner, apparently fully recovered from her recent illness.
The wedding marks the biggest security operation ever mounted in London, as Gavin Hewitt reports that tight security extends from arrangements for the day itself to embrace the many heads of state and other guests in London for the wedding.
The occasion of a brief visit to St. Paul's Cathedral by America's First Lady illustrated something of the quite extraordinary security that will surround the royal wedding. The image of the solitary, disturbed figure seeking out a vast global television stage has haunted these preparations. Before Mrs. Reagan arrived, a team of women police cadets were combing the grounds with metal detectors. When the area is closed to traffic prior to the wedding, teams of sniffer dogs and explosives experts will search the route, the sewers underneath, and every corner of the cathedral. Today, the raincoats of the City of London police could not disguise their bulletproof vests or the .38s underneath. Over 1,000 police will be armed for the wedding itself. Those lining the route will be facing towards the crowd with the responsibility for scanning on average 30 faces. The buildings checked today have all been asked to submit the names of those who will use the same balconies and windows in the city on Wednesday. Mrs. Reagan's Secret Service detail, who relinquished their sidearms on British soil, are said not to appreciate the congested streets and moving crowds. And today the President's wife was 30 minutes late. For the thousands of visitors in London, Mrs. Reagan is perhaps the best-known foreign guest. The purpose of today's event was to lay a wreath at the American Memorial Chapel for the 28,000 American servicemen based in Britain who died during the war. It is rare for Mrs. Reagan to travel without her husband, although, as she assured everyone, she calls the President every night.
Did you talk about meeting Lady Diana to the President?
Yes, and the Queen Mother, and the King and Queen, and the Prince Philip and the Queen.
What did you tell President Reagan?
Oh, what a wonderful thrill it was for me. Very exciting.
Are you looking forward to Wednesday?
I certainly am. Isn't everybody?
In Northern Ireland, Gerry Adams, Vice President of Sinn Féin, the political wing of the Provisional IRA, was detained by police this evening, along with 2 other Sinn Féin members. They've now all been released, but complain it was yet another attempt to harass people organising support for the hunger strikers. In Belfast, a policeman and a girl of 13 were shot and wounded in the Shankhill Road area. The shots were fired from a block of flats in the Falls area, and the Irish National Liberation Army say they were responsible. The policeman was knocking on a door investigating a hoax burglary and has a stomach wound. The girl was behind him and was hit in the leg. 2 soldiers are to appear in court in Londonderry on charges arising out of the deaths of 2 teenagers who were knocked down by an army Land Rover during rioting there on Easter Sunday. One is to be charged with reckless driving and causing the deaths, the other with aiding and abetting. Lord Widgery, the former Lord Chief Justice of England, died at his home last night, just 2 days after his 70th birthday. A solicitor who was called to the bar in 1946, Lord Widgery was jointly responsible with Lord Hailsham for the birth of the Crown Court system. He also conducted the inquiry into what's become known as the Bloody Sunday shootings in Northern Ireland. The Springbok rugby tour of New Zealand is to go on despite the violent anti-apartheid protests. The New Zealand rugby unions say that if they had submitted to the pressure to cancel it, it would have meant giving in to small groups of people using illegal methods. But following the abandonment of Saturday's match at Hamilton, the Army will give what's called logistic support to the police at future matches. The next fixture is at New Plymouth on Wednesday. Jim Biddulph reports.
The Springboks, who've only managed to play one match so far, were brought here despite official disapproval by the New Zealand rugby authorities, who tonight are sticking to their view that sport has nothing to do with politics. Despite what happened at Hamilton on Saturday, the police have decided that with military logistic support, they can control the rugby grounds, even though at major matches they'll have to use a quarter of New Zealand's entire force of under 5,000 policemen. Police Commissioner Bob Walton admits that his tactics at Hamilton didn't work as he'd hoped. The Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. McIntyre, accused the protesters today of having changed the issue from one of opposition to apartheid to a threat to the institutions of a democratic society. Tomorrow, Mr. McIntyre meets the caucus of the ruling party, but it's unlikely that this will affect the situation. Even if the rugby grounds themselves can be made secure, the demonstrations up and down the country seem certain to continue. New Zealand's normally calm and placid society is being torn apart. Jim Biddulph, BBC, New Zealand.
There was an anti-apartheid protest too in central London as Commonwealth leaders who are over here for the royal wedding arrived for a reception. The main target of the protesters was Mr. Muldoon. Before the reception, Mr. Muldoon was asked by Donald McCormack how firm was his government's policy of allowing sports bodies to make their own decisions.
Very firm policy. It's been there for a long, long time, and it's finally a matter of credibility of a government. And the policy is not just something that we've done capriciously. It is based on the fact that we are not taking away from sportsmen the right to make decisions in these matters.
Wouldn't the credibility of the government perhaps suffer even more if the series of matches with the Springboks has to go ahead in conditions of mounting violence and disruption?
No, I don't think so. Well, with some people, but not with our people in New Zealand, no.
The Labour Party's national executive today unveiled its plan to take Britain out of the common market within a year of taking office and without a referendum. It'll now go to Labour's annual conference in the autumn, where it's certain to be endorsed. Our political correspondent Rodney Foster looks at the details of Labour's plan to leave Europe.
In this 23-page document, the National Executive says that withdrawal from the EEC is the only logical policy from Britain. Membership, they say, was put to the people in 1975 as a miracle cure to solve all our political, economic and industrial problems. Instead, they say, the cure has become worse than the disease. Food prices pushed up by EEC taxes, industry rundown and jobs lost in the face of an EEC trade onslaught. So, at the next general election, the National Executive will put a clear choice to the British people. Vote Labour to take Britain out, or vote Conservative, whether the label is Tory, Liberal or SDP, to keep Britain in.
A Labour government's timetable for an orderly withdrawal would be published as a white paper within a few weeks of them taking office. Then would come a bill ending the EEC's legal powers in Britain. Finally, after more negotiations, they'd repeal the European Communities Act, breaking all formal links with the EEC. All this, it's hoped, within a year. It would mean withdrawal from all the community institutions, including the European Parliament, though many in the Labour Party have never had much time for what they regard as an expensive talking shop. Whilst hoping to complete withdrawal within a year, Labour's National Executive accept that transitional arrangements would have to be negotiated with our former EEC partners, and that this could lengthen the process quite considerably. And at a news conference today, it was also conceded that there were risks. The possible threat of some multinational companies pulling out of Britain altogether, with tariff barriers and restricted access for British goods to EEC markets.
The greatest problem, of course, is that the pattern of world trade has somewhat changed since we became members of the European Economic Community, and therefore it will not be simple merely to pick up the markets that we had previously, and I think everybody recognises that. And that, I think, is the biggest risk. But on the other hand, we will be able to go out and, certainly in relation to agricultural products, be able to get agricultural products on the world market, and in our view, much cheaper than we get them at the present moment inside the common market.
But the single most important advantage of withdrawal, according to Labour's executive, would be that the next Labour government could determine its own economic and industrial policies.
The argument over EEC fishing has been resumed in Brussels. Ministers have been discussing whether to lift the ban on catches of herring in British waters, at present banned in the North Sea and off the Scottish west coast. The EEC Commission favours a resumption, but subject to a limit on catches. The French want much bigger quotas. The Minister of State for Fisheries, Mr. Alex Buchanan-Smith, warned that the community cannot afford a free-for-all. And we've just heard that the fisheries meeting in Brussels has ended without any agreement whatsoever. The British President of the Fisheries Council, Mr. Peter Walker, suggested there should be a continuing moratorium on herring fishing, but this was refused by Denmark, Belgium, Italy and France. Finally, some good news for a group of handicapped children from the Department of Health. For the past 3 years, a select group of these handicapped children have been trying out an artificial hand, designed in Sweden but developed in Britain. Now it's disclosed that the experiment has been a success and that the hand will be available from the National Health Service. Gerald Butt reports.
The new hand has been given the label myoelectric. It's battery operated and is worked by the movements of muscles in the arm. The original development was done in Sweden, but this latest device has been modified and produced in Britain. Each costs £1,000. The good news, though, is they'll now be available on the National Health. And already there are satisfied customers.
And can you grip good and hard with your hand? Very tight. And are you happy with it?
Alongside the new myoelectric hand, the traditional and very effective mechanical hook will still be available. It's more flexible than the new hand, but doesn't look as good. Available too is a mechanical version of the new hand, which suits some children more. The myoelectric hand has been available in Sweden for some years. So why has it taken the government here so long to give its approval?
Well, the problems of reliability, the questions of how best to train a young child how to use a device of this kind, and these had to be overcome. But we've also achieved in this country a technological breakthrough. It's a great improvement on the original Swedish concept, and it's going to have worldwide implications for this country.
This new hand could be the answer for some of the 80 or so babies born each year without hands or who lose them in accidents. In fact, a significant contribution to the Year of the Disabled.
And now the main points of the news again. The government is spending £400 million to relieve unemployment. The package includes paying £15 a week towards the wages of youngsters getting a first job. Prince Charles and Lady Diana have been at a rehearsal in St Paul's this evening. Meanwhile, the wedding's producing the biggest security operation seen in London. And the South African tour of New Zealand is to go on. That's all from me for now. Good night.